Good morning. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Programming Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and I am very pleased to welcome you to the beginning of our 2023 Great Decisions series. Our speaker today is Raymond Kuo, who will speak on China and the United States. Raymond Kuo is a political scientist and director of the Taiwan Policy Initiative at the RAND Corporation. He is an expert in international security in East Asia with two recent books, Following the Leader, International Orders, Alliance Strategies and Emulation, and Contests of Initiative, Confronting China's Gray Zone Strategy. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota, Global Minnesota, and the Foreign Affairs Association. We are deeply grateful to all these organizations. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn things over to our speaker, Dr. Raymond Kuo, on China and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So hopefully you can all see the presentation that I prepared. So yeah, I'll be talking today about China and the United States. Yeah, we've already gone over who I am. So the key questions I want to answer today are, how should we understand great power competition between the United States and China? Secondly, what must the US do to win? And then what should the US do vis-a-vis Taiwan? And the main takeaways from all this is that we should think about competition between China and the United States as systems competition. It's about competing visions of the international order. The US has to engage in domestic renewal and lead internationally. And I've argued recently that the US should adopt strategic clarity towards Taiwan. And essentially the outline for today's discussion will go through each one of those points in turn. So in terms of US-China competition, this is about competing visions of the international order, about the rules, principles, and policies that states expect and are considered acceptable versus not acceptable. These could include things like diplomatic immunity, we don't kill the messenger, or things like territorial sovereignty, we don't invade other countries. And critically, an international order has to do two things. It has to attract foreign partners, and it has to provide domestic benefits for the, say, hegemonic state. And so for the United States, our vision of order is fairly clearly laid out in the 2022 National Security Strategy. They talk about an inclusive world, a prosperous world. This is not that surprising because the authors of the National Security Strategy also wrote a book about 2 or 3 years before, Rebecca Lissner and Mira Rapp-Hooper, called An Open World. It's this idea of the US should be fostering open engagement, whether that's in terms of economics, politics, social engagement in the world. And I think the way to think about the American vision of order kind of harkens back, at least in my mind, to the Spider-Man movie. This is the original one with Tobey Maguire, and it kind of launches that iconic phrase that with great power comes great responsibility. I actually, when I teach this, kind of flip it a little bit. I say that with great power comes great liability. And the issue is that if you're the hegemon, especially at the United States at the end of World War II, you have so much power. You can make promises to everybody. You can say, follow my leadership, and I will do X, Y, and Z things. But you have so much power, you can break those promises really, really easily. So this is a liability for you. You want people to follow you, and yet because you are so strong, the people, the followers also know that they can't fully trust you. So how do you deal with this issue? Well, John Eikenberry in 2001, he wrote a book, and he talks about having a constitutional vision of the international order. What you're essentially doing is saying, okay, look, I know I'm really, really powerful, but I'm going to give you a say in my decision-making and policy-making process. I'm going to create international institutions where you can participate and have inputs, and I will bind myself to those institutions, so I will follow the rules that we have all collectively set up. I will get less power, or I cannot exert as much of my power in the short term, but I will enhance the longevity of my power over the long term. And so in the United States, post-World War II, we saw the US go on kind of an institution building spree, a multilateral institution building spree, focusing on trade and economics. That's the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, security architecture, which includes NATO and a bunch of other alliances around the world, and even things like human rights and democracy. Now, I'm not saying that the US, that we've always lived up to the rules or even the norms embedded within these institutions, but we at least have created some sort of way that other countries can bind our power and trust us more and then embed our leadership within the international system. And today I want to focus a bit on the economic side of American and also Chinese statecraft. So when we think about, why would the United States create the WTO or the IMF? Well, part of the reason is because we've got really innovative companies. Remember I said that international orders have to provide, not only attract foreign support, but also provide domestic benefits. And one thing is that if we have really innovative companies, well, market competition we think is generally pretty good. And the government is generally bad at picking winners and losers. So what do we want to do? We want to create an international system where our companies can go out, march into the international system and compete with others and essentially dominate the global markets. Also, because of this globalization process, we create network effects where we are the center of finance and capital, and that gives us not just economic power, but also to some extent security power. There's a SWIFT system. If you want to do an international transaction, you have to register that transaction on the SWIFT system. That means that we, in the United States, we control that system. It means that we can see a good chunk or the vast lion's share of the international transactions that are happening and use that information to our advantage. And so we create an economic system, an economic international order governed by the WTO that favors economic competition, relatively little political interference, and an open society and open international economy. The Chinese vision of order is somewhat different. While they buy in to some extent with the economic openness, they also talk about having a peaceful rise for China, emphasizing win-win development, especially among developing countries. And they also speak often about multipolarity. You can see that they highlight the BRICS. Oh, that is a little blurry than I thought it would be. The BRICS as a sort of alternative grouping for international order and power. And they have followed this up with things like the Belt and Road Initiative, sort of a string of major infrastructure projects connecting lots of Asia with Europe and Africa and with Oceania, both on the overland routes as well as on maritime routes, as you can see here. They've put in a bunch of money. I think they've pledged about $1 trillion over the course of the BRI. It touches, as you can see here, 61% of the world's population. And just lots and lots of money and personnel and effort being thrown into this. And to the point that they are the leading. The Belt and Road Initiative encompasses the leading projects in the energy sector, transportation, real estate, chemicals, a whole bunch of these sort of major sectors. These are the ones that are like the kind of the leaders in this international field. But it's important to understand that there are domestic drivers here. Remember, international order is driven to some extent, and it comes out of the domestic level economic and political dynamics of your own country. And so one thing when we think about Chinese growth, which has been kind of phenomenal over the last 30 years, is how did they actually do this? Well, the first thing to understand is that the central government sets national level growth targets, saying, we want to have 10% growth this year, or 8% growth this year, or 12% growth this year. And they say, okay, we're going to set this target. And you at the provincial level, you guys have to meet or exceed this target. So if I'm, the head of Guangdong province, I'm saying, okay, well, how do the central government has set an 8% target. Well, I want my province to beat that. So I'm going to tell my local governments, okay, you guys need to get 10% growth. And that way we can meet this national level target. And so now at the local level, they're like, crap, what do we do? How can we actually produce this type of growth? So they create state-owned enterprises, organizations, companies really, that can gather together political power, economic finance, and personnel and direct them towards particular projects. Typically, these are funded through land sales and debts. I as a local government will sell a certain portion of this land to a state-owned bank, and so long as my debt interest rate is lower than my rate of return, I'm going to be successful. And generally speaking, that's the case in China. China, at the end of the I guess the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, it was extremely impoverished to the point that any sort of investment would jumpstart growth. And so you would get, for relatively low interest rates, you would get a very, very high rate of return. And so because of this, your rate of return, the high rate of return kind of suggests that you should just keep expanding. And eventually, in economic theory, the rate of return, the debt level should kind of balance out and you'll get this sort of steady state of growth. Problem is, that ignores politics. The central government is still setting those targets. The provincial governments are still saying that to the localities, you have to meet these targets. And so what do? They have to keep trying to expand, even if there aren't productive investments to be made. There's significant overcapacity within the Chinese market, and the market's kind of tapped out. So what do you end up doing? Well, you take your expertise and you go internationally, because maybe your domestic market is tapped out, but you still can construct really large things for relatively cheaply, and there's a whole bunch of other people out there that need infrastructure projects as well. So you go out internationally, you create this Belt and Road Initiative, or at least President Xi Jinping announces it, and then everyone says, yeah, we're part of the Belt and Road too, and you create a whole bunch of construction projects around the world. Now, for the recipients, you get great, cheap infrastructure. That's wonderful. For China, you divert your overcapacity. You can allow your economy to keep growing. You have built up your domestic market. Now you're adding this major international market. The domestic drivers extend to a foreign economic statecraft. Everything's golden, right? Except not really. So the important thing to remember is that these are mostly state-owned enterprises that are running it. And like we saw with the Soviet Union, state-owned enterprises are not free market actors. They seek economic returns to some extent, but they also seek political returns. It's about propping up the employment level and meeting certain GDP growth targets within your locality or your province. You tend to take on relatively risky projects. You tend to ignore feasibility studies. Kind of my favorite example is this highway to nowhere in Montenegro. The idea here was that the Chinese would build this major highway that connects the coastline with Serbia, and so you'll get this massive economic corridor where people will drive and they'll stop off and they'll eat and do other things. It'll be great. You'll connect Montenegro, this tiny little country, to its larger Serbian neighbor, and you'll get much more economic activity as a result. This is now, I believe, an eighth of Montenegro's debts. There's, I think, essentially no chance they'll ever pay this off. It ran out of money, so it kind of ends right here in the middle of a field or a forest. And I think one of the things that was kind of a problem was that, another thing was the Serbian side, right, was supposed to build a highway as well to connect with it. The Serbs never built the highway, so it literally goes nowhere. It starts and ends nowhere. On top of that, one kind of thing about BRI projects is that they're often opaque. The negotiation structure, the contracts often are not publicly available. And evidently, one thing that was forgotten in these contracts was to negotiate who builds the on-ramps. And so you literally have a highway that goes nowhere that you can't get onto, especially if there's like a kind of a gully or something like that. So this is a real problem. You've got bad money chasing after, or good money chasing after bad. You've got SOEs that are more interested in the political side of things as opposed to economic return. And eventually, this foundational condition that your rate of return is higher than your debt interest rate, well, what happens when that's no longer the case? What happens when you've tapped out the international market as well? And this is all an outgrowth of what we call Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. If we're saying GDP is our target, then GDP is the input, GDP growth is the input into our system. It is not the output to our system. In the United States, in capitalist economies, we don't say we must hit a certain degree of GDP growth. We say, let's increase our productivity, let's add technology, and the outgrowth of that will be economic growth. In China, it's the reverse. You must hit this economic target, so you do everything you can to do that. And that leads to bad quality debt and bad quality investment. This is not driven by market fundamentals. It's about investment and output, not actually sustainable consumption. And so you get good money chasing after bad. So that's second point. It's about investment and output, not consumption. What does that mean? It means that you have things like ghost cities, really, really large construction projects. Actually, now I see this is not the best picture, but large neighborhoods, full cities to some extent, where there are just no people there. There were all these construction projects that were built based on the idea that we'll get this good rate of return, and we'll kind of push off the residency issue into the future. But people don't live there because they're either unattractive, or they don't have the social services, or they don't have schools. And so you'll get these ghost cities where it's all about the investment and the output, but nobody actually consuming the housing, nobody actually living in these buildings. And so as a result, the housing market in China is one of the biggest, is kind of like the United States, is the lion's share of the economy, or like it's a major mover in the economy. And you're seeing that housing prices are just dropping dramatically in China. This is really bad because, well, your rate of return is going down. And so as a result, you're not able to grow as fast. And what do you do in this sort of situation? Well, you can either try to take on more debt, which just exacerbates the problem, or you can start cutting back. And that's really, really hard to do given the political forces within China have grown up around this particular economic model. And so for China, their debt to GDP ratio in the orange line here is equivalent to ours, and that's problematic. Like, we have a fairly high debt to GDP ratio, but we've got a couple of advantages. One, we're rich already. Two, we have the reserve currency. China has neither of those things, and their debt to GDP ratio seems like it's going to keep going up for at least the next 10, 15 years. That's a real problem for a relatively poor country to handle. You have to make significant cutbacks that, like in the United States, maybe you don't get the iPhone, that latest iPhone that you want. You tighten your belt a bit. In China, that means that a significant portion of the population might face undernourishment or lack of medical care. The effects are just much, much worse in a developing economy. China's GDP growth has slowed down pretty dramatically as a result of this debt burden, and also as a result of its development. And as we saw fairly recently, there is the aging population that China is going to grow old before it grows rich. Now, the recent report saying, hey, China's population has actually contracted, I think that's a little bit overblown. People knew, we kind of knew it was going to happen for a while. The main issue is that it happened 10 years before even the latest projections expected. There's less time to adjust to this expectation. That's the real concern from a policy perspective for China. And so when we think about kind of looping this all the way back, strategic competition, is this sort of downward trajectory, these increasing constraints on the Chinese economy, is that good or bad for strategic competition between the United States and China? Well, we could say this is good because China is not going to win great power competition. Its economy is not going to keep growing as fast as it has, and it's going to encounter these debt problems. The BRI, which was kind of the jewel, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is kind of the jewel of Xi Jinping's sort of foreign policy, there's all these projects are going to turn to albatrosses. I think there was a statistic saying that 25% of BRI dollars or investment has had to be renegotiated in some way. And that's before a lot of the debts are really coming due. So we could kind of quickly see that there's a sort of spillover effect. There's just lack of confidence in these infrastructure investments and the creditworthiness of the recipient countries. And so maybe George Kennan was right. We can just take this old Cold War Soviet approach and apply it to China. We just need to be patient, and we just wait on the Chinese internal contradictions. Eventually it will collapse, and we in the United States win. That's the positive way of looking at this. There's also a negative way that, look, the economy may be coming down, but military modernization lags behind economic growth. So the military is on an upswing, the economy is on a downswing. This gives China a closing window of opportunity where it has to strike now. because it will be at the apex of its power, but they can see in 10, 15 years into the future, they will no longer be able to compete with the dynamism of the United States, Europe, Japan, Australia. So this is an issue. This is the subject of the argument by this book. Was it this year or last year? Called Danger Zone by Hal Brands is a professor at Johns Hopkins, and Michael Beckley is a professor at Tufts. They're saying this is actually really, really bad because because of the closing window of opportunity, Beijing has to strike now. And so what they argue is that we're going to see for the next 10, 15 years, a increased belligerence by Beijing in order to grab as much as it can before it's not able to do that anymore. So given this picture, what should the US do? The US has been fairly effective in corralling support from the Japanese, the Australians, traditional allies and partners, even Europe in responding to the threat that China and also Russia pose. But it's one thing to give countries something to run away from. To be effective, however, you need to give them something to run towards. It's not just the power of fear, but this what we call soft power, the power of traction, of an example, of being that shining city on the hill. And so the US has to provide a positive vision based on two things. First, domestic renewal, and second, democracy. And then actually, there should be a third one here in terms of foreign policy leadership. Look, we have crumbling infrastructure. Our inequality level is kind of close to the Roaring '20s, which was not a great period for American inequality. And incidentally, more equitable societies tend to be they tend to grow faster. They tend to have better outcomes in terms of health and obviously income and everything else. And those tend to kind of spiral in a positive sense that the healthier your population is, the more they can work, the more you distribute your income, the more innovative more parts of the population can be. It's like you can have one Elon Musk, or you can have 1,000 lower level innovative engineers. You want to bet on the 1,000 engineers because they're going to eventually produce much, much more. Especially given what Elon Musk has been doing recently, maybe he's not all that smart. Also, our educational system has over the last, this is a graph of changes from 2008 to 2015, we've been hollowing out our educational system. This is the change in state spending per student at the higher ed level. And you can see most states are in the red. We have been reducing support for our higher education, which is one of the most innovative, is a key driver of innovation in our economy, which is what we need to keep growing. And of course, there's democracy. January 6th was just bad. It was a validation to authoritarian countries around the world that, look, the US is not as good as it thinks it is. Democracy is not as good as it thinks it is. All you kind of protesters or social movements clamoring for democracy, for having a greater voice in politics, well, you should just shut up because you can see even the icon of democracy, they can't get their stuff done. You should just listen to what the strong men say. And if we don't do that, you could say like, okay, great. Well, we could just bet on China declining. We don't have to bet on us rising. But the problem here comes down to one between hedging versus alignment. We can get alignment with some countries. You get some countries that come closer to us and follow our lead. But unless we can demonstrate the superiority of our domestic and system and our international foreign policy, a whole bunch of countries are just going to be unsure if they actually want to line up with us. This can have an impact politically, say votes in the United Nations General Assembly. This can have an impact militarily. The fact that the US has to really be, it's kind of uncertain whether or not the Philippines would let the US use its bases in a war between, say, China and Taiwan is a real issue for any kind of military operation. It's a problem economically. We may want to align other countries with our global trading system, but so long as they're not sure about whether we're better partners or the Chinese are better partners, they'll just continue trading with us both. And so given all that, I think my recommendation is that in terms of foreign policy, we have to lead. And the biggest spot for that is Taiwan, which I think The Economist has unhelpfully called the most dangerous place on earth. I mean, maybe, I guess, it's the primary locus for great power war or competition. It's a lovely place. My family lives there. You should all go visit. It has great food. The foundation for our strategy in Taiwan has been what we call strategic ambiguity. The United States does not let China nor Taiwan know whether or not it will intervene in a war between China and Taiwan. And the reason why is this. In political science, we call strategic ambiguity actually a form of what we call pivotal deterrence. Where's the, I'll need my, there we go, laser pointer. So the United States here is the pivot, and China and Taiwan want to go to war with each other, and we're nominally partners with Taiwan, and then China over here is our adversary. And so the whole idea is that, someone once told me that you realize you finally arrived as a parent when you truly, genuinely do not care who started it. You just don't care what the fight is about. You just want them to stop fighting. And that's essentially what happens with China and Taiwan. After the wake of the 1949 Civil War between the Chinese and who are now the Taiwanese, the nationalists fled to Taiwan, and throughout the 50s and 60s, there was this fear, justifiable, that the Taiwanese leader and the Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek on the one hand and Mao Zedong on the other, would just restart the Civil War. And there was a fear that, it could be the Chinese who start this. It could be the Taiwanese who start this. We don't care. We just want you guys not to fight. And so what we will do is, when it seems like the Chinese are going to start something, well, we'll throw our support, our decisive military power behind the Taiwanese. When it seems like the Taiwanese are going to start doing something, however, we'll throw that decisive support behind China. And so in this way, we can prevent conflict because both sides want to curry our favor. We avoid entrapment because we say, look, our support is not unconditional. We're not going to support you no matter what. We're going to support you when you behave. And it gives us, as the United States, immense foreign policy latitude. We can choose to engage versus not engage. It's our choice whether or not, and we have that sort of decisive, pivotal influence over the relationship between these two countries. The problem is, pivotal deterrence requires three things. First, the pivot actually has to have decisive pivotal power. Secondly, the opponents have to want conflict more than the pivot. And thirdly, the opponents can't be irrational. They can't just really, really, really want to go to war. So for number one, we are no longer really the pivot anymore. This is from a 2015 RAND report that's saying in these 9 operational areas here, by 2017, the United States will have parity, and the Chinese may even have an advantage in 5 of 9 of these operational areas. We're only going to have an advantage in kind of a moderate one at that, and say cyber war, submarine warfare, air bases. Everything else is not looking all that rosy for the United States. For the second factor, that the adversaries have to want war more than the pivot. Well, Taiwan really doesn't want to go to war. China's power has grown by leaps and bounds over the last 20 years. I believe since 2001, its military budget has increased by 5-fold. Taiwan is vastly outmatched by the Chinese military, and in the wake of Pelosi's visit last year, China bracketed the island with military drills and missile overflights as a demonstration of their anger. The Taiwanese are not interested in a war. The Taiwanese presidents have taken really strong efforts not to provoke the Chinese, and so the status quo has fundamentally changed. And our policy has to change as a result. Strategic ambiguity, this sort of wishy-washiness of will we, won't we intervene? Well, that only worked when we had that decisive power. It does not, that's just not true. Our policy has to change in response. One major concern by the United States is like, well, if we give Taiwan an unconditional commitment, won't they just use that to declare independence? The problem is, I mentioned Michael Beckley in that book earlier. He wrote an article, a bunch of other people have written articles, the RAND Corporation has done a report, finding that entrapment almost never happens. There have been maybe 5 instances over the last 70 years where countries tried to entrap the United States. in only maybe one was the United States possibly entrapped, and even there the evidence is kind of shaky. So this idea that, you know, if we give a commitment and Taiwan will just declare independence, the issue is that we can always just go home, right? Yes, Taiwan may do that, but they realize, as we also realize, we're the big kid on the block. We can just take our ball and go home, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop it. So entrapment really isn't a concern, and China has its own strategic clarity. We tend to think that strategic ambiguity means, well, Taiwan is uncertain, but so too is China. China's not certain about whether or not we're going to intervene. That couldn't be further from the case. China is very, very clear that that the United States will intervene in a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. They've planned for it, they've prepared for it. They have their own strategic clarity, and our ambiguity, the ambiguity itself, does nothing to deter China. What deters China is our military power and Taiwanese military power. So overall, because of this change to the status quo, our current policy of strategy of strategic ambiguity, it has not adapted to Chinese the rise in Chinese military power. It does not confuse nor deter China, and it doesn't prevent Taiwanese entrapment. The only thing it does is prevent an optimal Taiwanese defense. Because they cannot be certain about whether or not the US will show up, they have to do things like buy major weapon systems that are quite ineffective against the Chinese, but engage our reputation, engage our status, engage our prestige as a way to draw us in. And so they're trading off effective defense for a wishy-washy commitment, and it's a bad situation for everyone involved. By contrast, there are lots of benefits to clarity. We gain greater political leverage over Taiwan. We can say, okay, look, if we're going to show up, you guys have to do X, Y, and Z things. And part of those things will be better defense acquisition by the Taiwanese. It's not all that different from what's going on right now, and even more importantly, it will reassure regional allies. Japan and South Korea are really, really concerned about what the US is going to do vis-a-vis Taiwan. Why? Because, I should put this quote up here. MacArthur called Taiwan an unsinkable aircraft carrier and submarine tender. He was saying that if the communists at the time, China, were able to secure Taiwan, it would allow them to project power well onto the Pacific Ocean, as well as north into the South China Sea, and south into the South China Sea, and north into Japan and South Korea. Taiwan sits astride the major maritime trade routes for anything going for Japan and South Korea. Anything that's not coming east to the United States is going down south and then to the west. If China owns Taiwan, they're able to constrict both South Korea and Japan very, very easily. So the reason why I make such a point of this is that it's a big debate right now about whether or not we should maintain strategic ambiguity or shift, as I've argued, to strategic clarity. The one thing I'll say is that within political science, within social science, we have a phrase that there is no causation without variation. You cannot explain a constant with you cannot explain a variable with a constant. What's the best way of putting this? Like, why does the sun rise and set every day? Well, you could say, and this is kind of a bad argument, but like it has to do with, I don't know, the fact that I have a car in my garage. And let's just say I have the car just never goes anywhere. Well, I can say like, well, I have this car in my garage, and that explains why the sun goes up and down. But the car doesn't move. It always stays in the garage. So it can't explain why the sun is up and why the sun is down. Similarly so, when we think about strategic ambiguity, well, some people have argued this is the best policy we have and we should just keep doing it. Problem is, we've been keep doing it the entire time, and the situation has changed. In fact, some of that situation, they may have changed because of our policy of strategic ambiguity. So if we really want to deal with this changed situation, we have to change our own policy itself. We have to shift in response to this new status quo with strategic clarity. So with that, I'm happy to take your questions. And I'll stop sharing the screen somehow. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. Raymond Kuo, and now I will invite the audience to put questions in the Q&A line, and I see we have a few already. I'm going to give myself the privilege of asking the first question. When you were speaking about strategic ambiguity, the policy of strategic ambiguity, I immediately thought of Joe Biden's recent, quite strong declarations of support for Taiwan. And so my question is that part of the strategy somehow to keep things off balance? Or is that Joe Biden being Joe Biden and sort of getting in the way of the strategy?
I honestly don't know. There is a big debate within the administration right now over what we should do. I'll put it this way. When Biden says these things, the State Department immediately walks it back. And so there's a certain degree of not strategic ambiguity or clarity, just strategic confusion, because nobody knows what's actually going on and nobody can really figure out, like, I mean, maybe it's having the same effect of this confusion that we have from strategic ambiguity. But I don't think it fundamentally addresses the drawbacks to that strategy. I will say that, part of the issue, part of the debate has to do with the Taiwan Relations Act, which was signed in 1979 after the United States switched recognition from Taiwan to China. Now, a lot of the same people calling for the continuation of strategic ambiguity say the Taiwan Relations Act is nothing but an arms sales agreement. It's just us being willing to sell arms. It's nothing more than that. The problem is that's not true. The law was written specifically to mirror the language of the existing American alliances in East and Southeast Asia. And so it has a lot of that same language of a threat to Taiwan is a threat to the regional stability, and we consider that a threat to us. And so part of the issue here is that Joe Biden signed, and he voted on the Taiwan Relations Act. He can very much think like, no, because of that language, we actually are committed to Taiwan. And by the way, the other thing is that with something like NATO, for example, that's an international treaty. A US president can't really be impeached for not following NATO. The Taiwan Relations Act is American domestic law. A US president can be impeached for not following the Taiwan Relations Act. And it doesn't matter that the act doesn't actually say the US will defend under these conditions. It matters what enough congressmen and representatives and senators say is the letter of the law, and that's what will result in impeachment, if that is the case.
Okay. All right. Let me turn to the questions that our viewers have put in. The first one is, will this talk be recorded for review later? The answer to that is yes. And as soon as I have a minute, I'll put the link to our website. The talk will be posted within a few days. It won't be posted immediately after this conversation, but I will put the link in for anyone in the audience who's interested. If you miss the link, you can always find it on our website or just email me and I will give it to you. But now let me turn to a question for our speaker. What happens if China throws its military weight behind Russia in the Ukraine? Is this very unlikely? And maybe you just want to comment more broadly on the implications of the Ukraine-Russia war for the Taiwan-Chinese situation.
Sure. So it depends on what we mean by throwing its military weight. I don't expect that China will send troops, for example. Its position within this conflict, within this war, on this war has been, we are a neutral arbiter. You can trust us to be an honest broker to find some kind of peace agreement. That kind of goes out the window if China says, okay, we're gonna send troops. It kind of goes out the window if China starts sending lethal aid to Russia. If they kind of serve as the Europeans and the Americans have been doing for the Ukrainians as a kind of a backfill for their Russian production. Ukraine and Russia have been burning through munitions at an astonishing rate. I think 1 million shells a month. And we have nothing close to that capacity. Russia is even worse. They have nothing even further from that capacity, but if they can draw upon Chinese ammunition and other military production, that will stop one of their big gaps in the Russian war effort. And so in terms of the implications of this, one, China right now they're trying to reinvigorate their ties with Europe because the EU is China's largest trading partner. COVID-0 was a disaster economically for China. And so they're really trying to jumpstart in this 2023 year, greater economic relationships with the EU. If they throw more of their military weight behind Russia, those relations have no chance of improving. And I think that's part of the reason why Secretary Blinken announced that the Chinese are thinking about providing lethal aid. One, U.S. intelligence has been extremely effective during the Ukraine, in the Russian war in Ukraine. This kind of builds upon that reputation and says, hey, China, A, don't do this. B, do you really want to piss off all the Europeans gathered here in Munich right now, who you need to rely upon in order to jumpstart your economy? But we'll see. Putin is meeting with she's going to Russia at some point within the next couple months. They'll probably be talking about this and or a possible peace initiative. What is more likely is that what really determine this is, what do the spring offensives look like? Once the ground thaws, once the snow is gone, who's winning these offensives? Is it Russia or is it Ukraine?
We have another question about Russia's relationship to China with regard to Ukraine. A recent Washington Post report, this person says, discussed how the imperial role of NATO members, including the US with respect to Vietnam, has resulted in persistent animosity to the West's support of Ukraine in much of the non-European world, non-North American world, for example, in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East. What are the implications of this, basically?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I think this is really what I mean by the US has to actually lead. For quite a while, we've been withdrawing from international engagement. I think China actually now has the most representatives within, say, the UN staffing and leadership, which we easily could do, but Ted Cruz really likes to put holes on anybody he even marginally doesn't like. Nobody likes him because he does things like this. Yeah. And I went to Princeton where he did, and I went decades later, and people are still like, yeah, no, he's a douche. So anyway, but so I think this is where the US really does need to lead. The UN General Assembly just yesterday voted to condemn Russia. What's it called? In the immediate aftermath of the war, there were 2 General Assembly votes where, again, the vast majority of the members voted to condemn Russian actions here. This is something that the United States should be kind of leveraging. We should be leading and saying, look, we are standing up for territorial sovereignty. We are standing up to defend a small country against a much larger one's predation. It's the reason why countries like Japan and Australia, countries like the Philippines and Taiwan and South Korea why many of you guys are trying to develop stronger security ties with the United States, because you're not sure about these countries. You're not sure if they respect you and they respect your territorial sovereignty. So we should be getting that message out there. It's completely true that the US has kind of screwed up our legacy. And this is one of the many reasons why I think Kissinger is great at the tactical level, terrible at the strategic level, because he's very, very happy to gain short-term advantage while sacrificing our longer-term interests and credibility. And right now we see, this questionnaire, I think, Kathy, your question is exactly right. This is the outcome of that, that we have, in many cases, sacrificed our credibility by not following the rules that we have set ourselves. And so it leads to other countries being like, well, we can't trust you. And that's not a situation we should even be in. And it's a situation we can dig ourselves out of, but we have to take the international leadership.
We have several more questions really that relate to Ukraine. Most of them are basically questioning the same ground that you just covered. Maybe we'll swing back to some of them. Here's a question, though. For ordinary Americans, why should the status of Taiwan matter? What's in it for us? Why should ordinary Americans agree to risk global nuclear war over who controls Taiwan?
Fair enough. I mean, so there's always a risk of nuclear war, right? There's a risk of nuclear war with Ukraine. There's a risk of nuclear war over any kind of. I think when the United States accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Sarajevo, there was a risk of nuclear war then. The problem is this: like, yes, you can let yourself be deterred by that, but that means why shouldn't you just give up everything? Like, why should, if we're willing to be deterred by nuclear war, then why should China stop at Taiwan? Why shouldn't China stop at Japan or Alaska or LA? You don't want to, you don't want to get into nuclear war? Totally understandable. But other people may not. There is a individual advantage to be seen as reckless. This is kind of the North Korean strategy, or the Nixon strategy, the madman theory of nuclear deterrence. So we have to calibrate our risk of global nuclear war and acceptance of that risk in order to achieve certain foreign policy objectives. And it's an open debate. I don't mean to belittle this whatsoever. It's an open debate whether or not that risk is worth it. But we should just recognize that the risk never goes away. The only time it goes away is if you fully capitulate. Now, why should ordinary Americans care about the status of Taiwan? Well, on the one hand, for Taiwan itself, like 80–90% of the most advanced chips in the world come from Taiwan. So if you want your technology to get faster and cheaper, you got to protect Taiwan. I think there are the security implications. The US having Taiwan there really constrains China into what we call the first island chain. I wish I had a map here. Anyway, because we're allied with South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and that means China really doesn't have anywhere to go if they want to go out to in the Pacific. Now you may ask, well, why does that matter? Does it really matter for our kind of lifestyle? And the answer is unequivocally yes. Asia is going to be the most economically dynamic region of the world. If you think that China owning Taiwan won't cause Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, ASEAN to redirect their trade relations towards China as opposed to us, that's absolutely going to happen. One other thing, I mentioned that we have the reserve currency that everyone prices in dollars. I know interest rates are relatively high right now, but they're still, like, I actually forgot, it's like what, 4%, maybe 3%, something like that, right? And that has an effect on your home price, right? You will pay maybe, if the baseline rate is, let's say 4%, you'll pay maybe like 4.755%, right? The borrowing rate for a home in Bangladesh is 15%. It's higher in other places. Do you want to be spending 15% or 20% of your home purchase price on something that just goes to a bank that you get nothing from? That's because we have the reserve currency. There are so many dollars floating through the international system. It keeps our interest rates low. If you want to ask, how does it affect us? Economically, it hits your pocketbook extremely directly. Free trade, for example, is another one. And that might be shifting, but free trade saves the average American on the order of $800 a year. And this was 10 years ago, maybe more. And so that's not nothing. That's not a ton, but it's also much more than most tax breaks, right? So we can, and when we think about what's in it for the ordinary American, it's that over time the instantaneous hit is actually fairly significant, and over time the hit, it compounds on itself just through issues of compound interest or lack of prestige or lack of control, that kind of thing.
And that sort of brings up another question. Circling back to your earlier part of your talk, we think of the American century beginning in 1945. Are we in the Chinese century? Is the 21st century going to be the Chinese century?
I mean, not if we do something about it. And I think we are. I think it's tricky to say that any one country owns a century or a kind of a time period. American dominance, let's say, the Cold War, for example, certainly wasn't an era of unalloyed American power. The post-Cold War since 1991, 1992 until, let's say, maybe like 2014, 2015 or so. Sure, that we could say that is the American unipolar moment. And in poli-sci, some people, they really call it a moment, that it doesn't last very long. And so I don't know if we ever really had a US century. We certainly had an American unipolar moment. I don't think that China is going to be, that the 21st century is going to be the Chinese century. But a lot of that comes down to the internal guts of the Chinese economy, that they have just major imbalances. And I want to emphasize that China's not unique here. Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore even, they've all the Asian tigers have gone through this sort of thing where it's driven by domestic investments and production and not consumption. And then once that debt reaches a certain level, you have this sort of strong economic contraction. Japan, for example, we talked about the lost decade of just kind of anemic growth. That's entirely due to the exact same dynamics that we're seeing in China right now. And so, I remember in the 80s, everyone talked about oh God, it's the Japanese menace, they're gonna take over everything. I remember Tom Clancy novel, which was just completely idiotic. A whole bunch of movies came out about it. I was like, about the hysteria that we had here over Japan, just map that onto the hysteria we're having right now with China.
And as part of that, the population, the slowing of the population growth in country after country in that area.
This is where racism and chauvinism have a real impact. The U.S. is not great about these issues. It's just worse. And so it really limits the ability to attract immigrants to your country. Right? And immigration is what keeps the United States on a positive population growth path. It is not our natural fecundity. It is entirely immigration. It's our soft power that we are a country that welcomes people and that will support them as they get themselves started. And so the further that we don't do that, the more it gives an advantage to our adversaries.
Okay. All right. Does putting group or country rights over the rights of individuals or individualism, is that good or bad for China's success and growth? Well, first of all, I'm going to ask you, does China do that? Does it put the rights of the group over the rights of the individual? And if that is the case, what effect does that have on China's growth and success?
I mean, when I was in college, a lot of my thinking was kind of revolved around this sort of debate between group versus individual rights. And I'm not sure that is the best framing. I'm not sure that's the way China sees things either. How do I put this? So we often think of group rights as coming at the detriment of individual rights, right? Or some sort of prerogative or policy, right? Affirmative action is kind of one of those main things, right? Where we think, oh, well, certain groups are getting a leg up and that must hurt other groups. But here's the issue, that doesn't apply in what we call a prisoner's dilemma. You look at a cop procedural show or that kind of thing. They always take the two perpetrators, alleged perpetrators, put them in different rooms. And the cops go to them and they're like, "Hey, person one, well, person two told me that you did it, so you got to make a deal with me right now." And they'll go to person two and say the exact same thing. And so both perpetrators will take a deal, which is actually bad for them. If they had just kept their mouths shut, they would actually kind of get a reduced penalty. In that sort of situation characterizes a whole bunch of things. Any public good, public education, water fountains, parks, pollution, that is all characterized by a prisoner's dilemma. Network effects, trade, kind of agglomeration effects, like the stuff that's on your cell phone, right? The fact that you go to Facebook because everyone else is there too. That's all a prisoner's dilemma as well. And so in prisoner's dilemmas, your individual rights and your group rights are actually completely aligned with each other. It's that not just in a prisoner's dilemma that I would be better off individually, or that we'd be better off as a group. I would actually be better off individually as well. And so the US has, with that framing, the US has done relatively poorly in understanding that most things in a complex society and a complex economy are actually driven by the prisoner's dilemma, as opposed to the sort of tension between group versus individual. China has done a bit better, but what they define as the group is actually not as good. And so a lot of that is focused on CCP control, right? It's not about the general society getting better. It's often about making sure that the CCP is remaining in power. And so, insofar as the CCP's, as Chinese growth has been good for the CCP, that's really helpful. But we've seen recently that they've cracked down on the tech sector, which is their most innovative sector. They've cracked down on foreign English tutors, which again has been a sort of dynamic sector as well. They said that you can only play video games 3 hours a week, and here are the specific hours, right? It's really silly, one. And then two, you've just given every cyber hacker the exact times to hack you, because we know when your system is going to be overloaded. We might as well hit it. So, good or bad for success and growth? Yes, in some cases, bad in others, is what I would say. But to be clear, we are also not great at this either.
Yeah. Why? Okay, here's a good question, kind of a pushback question. Why do we think Russia and China have imperialist ambitions when it is the US, the United States, that is the one with 750 bases around the world, including any number surrounding China? Something the US would never tolerate in its own, nearby regions. Who is actually the imperialist country?
It's a great question. Certainly when it came to the second Iraq War, it's a much more justifiable response. Whereas like the first Iraq War, Afghanistan, those are a bit like, it's fairly clear, like, with the first Iraq War in particular, the US is like, we do not want to be here. All right, let's just liberate Kuwait and we're just going to go home. Which means that we left the Shia in southern Iraq to die. So there are consequences of the non-imperialist, however we want to define this approach. I think I'm going to flip that question around. Why do we have 750 bases around the world? I'm not sure there's actually not 750 bases. There's when we actually talk about full bases, there are actually far fewer than that. Why are those countries letting us be there? Right? Especially if we can't. One thing about imperialism, right? One thing that eventually collapsed the British Empire was the emergence of local resistance groups throughout their empire. We're not facing them. Japan is not saying leave Okinawa. Japan is saying arm Okinawa. Australia is not saying leave our area. Australia is saying we would really like you to put a Marine Corps base here, right? It's the same way the reason why we have all those bases there is because these countries want us there.
Yeah.
The history of U.S. So in one of my books, I go through the history of military alliances by the United States, especially at the start of the Cold War. The issue is, if you look through the historical record, if you look through the records now, we generally want to be left alone. We don't want to be in places. And so we often put a whole bunch of conditions saying like, okay, we're only going to be there if you do X, Y, Z things. And by the way, we're going to add 2 more. And then there's a couple more things you got to do. We just really don't want to be there. And that's kind of the same way here. And so it kind of leaves that, it's really that the other countries want to be in with us. You think about NATO expansion in the 90s. The US didn't really want to expand. It was the Central and Eastern European countries that said, look, we really want to be with you. And that is my retort to kind of the Russian propaganda that comes out about the Ukraine war. If, for example, if Mexico signed a defensive alliance with China, the US response should not be, this is terrible, how dare you do that? The response should be, Jesus, what did we do wrong that our closest neighbor is signing with our adversary? We really screwed up somewhere. And that's the same that Russia should have thought about. What are we doing that's causing all of these other countries to fear us?
Speaking of Mexico, I heard yesterday on the The Daily, the New York Times podcast about China attempting to solve the supply chain difficulties that arose recently by relocating factories to Mexico. This was news to me, maybe news to a lot of people. What are the implications for what we've been talking about of that move, of that, I guess, offshoring of Chinese industry?
It's not that big of a deal. I mean, if China
Mhm,
wants to do that, that's great. It just means that it depends to some extent on which companies are doing it. State-owned enterprises, okay, that's an issue. Um,
mhm,
but private sector, they're chasing rates of return, which
mhm,
ends up being good generally for everyone.
mhm,
Are they doing it in sort of critical sectors? Okay, that is something to consider. Are they doing it in chemicals? And the reason why I say chemicals specifically is that it has a lot to do with our opioid crisis in the United States.
mhm,
We get a lot of our opioids going through from Mexico up north of the United States. That at least we get the chemical precursors. But the chemical precursors come from China, right?
yeah,
And so to some extent, because they have the largest chemical industry in the world,
mhm,
to some extent, this is bad, right?
mhm,
Because we will have, they're taking a lot of these if it's this industry, they're taking a lot of these factories and putting them in Mexico. To some extent, this is good because we have much, much better insight into what Mexico produces and where it goes than we do in
mhm,
China, right?
mhm.
So one weird thing is that if you can get the Chinese to onshore or offshore, I guess, to Mexico, that actually helps us with our control of the opioid problem.
Uh-huh.
I mean, there are a bunch of other things that we should be doing, like we had originally classified fentanyl and other opioids as a narcotic. We let that
Mhm,
expire, which
mhm.
is idiotic. Congress just didn't get off their butts to finish it because of gridlock.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
but insofar as the other stuff, that would actually be helpful in the opioid crisis.
All right. The questioner says, I just read that the Chinese foreign minister has called for a ceasefire between Russia and the Ukraine to permit negotiations. Does that signal that China will not send arms to Russia? Or is that posturing to enhance China's reputation as a broker outside of their presumed sphere of influence?
I don't think it signals either of those things.
Mhm.
Because it's one thing to call for a ceasefire. It's really cheap and easy to do so. I can call for a ceasefire right now. No one cares. Um, are they actually going to put their money where their mouth is? Right? Are they going to say, hey, look, Ukraine, unless you do a ceasefire, we're going to start supplying Russia with weapons. Russia, unless you agree to ceasefire, we're going to start cutting off. We're not going to buy your oil and gas. Like none of that stuff. The Chinese are like, I think, are really, they tend to have a foreign policy that wants to reserve as much latitude as possible um,
Mhm.
in their foreign policy decisions. We do too. The problem is, unless you're willing to pony stuff up and
Mhm.
actually put things on the table, nobody takes it serious. And so this is, at least in my mind, they call for a ceasefire, but most people in Europe were like, okay, what are you going to do? And the Chinese have said nothing about that. Like, what leverage, if Beijing were really smart about this, they would actually outline a plan. All they've done so far is say this, we just believe in peace and stability, and we're not willing to condemn the
Yeah.
Russians, even though they're really clearly
Mhm.
wrong. Um,
Mhm.
they don't offer anything.
Yeah. Another question is quite similar. I think it says, do you think that China has much influence over Russia, at least in terms of Ukraine or really for anything else? What is the relationship between China and Russia most broadly? Who is the dominant figure? What's the dependent? Or does those terms not apply?
No, I mean, I think, we're seeing a reversal of what happened during the Cold War, where Russia was a much stronger nation than China
Mhm,
was. Now,
mhm,
China, the Cold War ratio um, between Russia on top and China on the bottom is like, China is like way, way, way higher now versus Russia,
yeah. Mhm,
at least on that ratio term. But all that said, and China is its main partner right now. Um,
mhm,
its main source of international, like it has main outlet for its international influence, the main purchaser of its primary exports, which are oil and gas. The problem is that should give China a lot of leverage over Russia. The problem comes down to Russian domestic politics and domestic structure. I do mean this in the specific social science term. Russia is a personalistic dictatorship. There is no party or military that constrains Putin's power. It comes down to just that one man. And so what happens in personalistic dictatorships that you get yes men, right? And people who just tell you yes, and they don't give you the right information. And so there's some suggestion that Putin launched this war because he thought it'd be really, really easy because that's what everyone was telling him. And so this has a couple implications for China's ability to influence Russia. You're not influencing Russia, you're influencing Putin. And Putin's entire, what does Putin really care about? Political survival, which is why he has to win this war, or at least not lose it somewhere, right? Yeah. And so there's only so much that oil sales and oil purchases and gas purchases can do to influence that kind of thing. Plus, it gets to an issue of perception. Does Putin realize that China is putting the screws on him? And then lastly, you have the North Korea problem. So the North, like China, the Chinese leadership really hates the North Koreans. They're like, they're the...
Why do they hate the North Koreans?
Okay, I'm just gonna say it. Because on the international stage, they're assholes. And we all have an asshole relative.
You mean for objective reasons?
Oh yeah, no, but I mean like, we all have an asshole cousin or uncle or something. And when you get to Thanksgiving, right, you know that dude. It's usually a dude, right? You know that guy. And what happens? You don't take that guy out. You don't take that guy to meet your friends, right? Because he's just gonna just take the dump on everything. And so that's what North Korea does. The reason why China has to be okay with it is because North Korea is right there on their border. And a North Korean collapse would be horrific for China. You would have floods of refugees. The US, South Korea would be like, all right, we're just going to take over now. And I guess we're going to reunite Korea and we're going to be a US ally. And it's a terrible situation for the Chinese. And so they're stuck between a rock of, we really don't like the North Koreans because they make it really hard for us to project ourselves as a responsible stakeholder, but we also can't let them go because they will collapse. And Russia's kind of going the same way. What happens if Russia collapses? China shares a really long border with Russia. Granted, there aren't that many people there, but is a Russian political collapse, in other words, Putin dying, is that in Chinese interests? No. Well, then you kind of got to keep supporting it. You can't really lose as much.
I see. You talk about Russia as a personification that Putin has no institutional checks on him, on himself, and yet Xi Jinping is the most powerful leader in China since Mao, probably, and the Chinese system it seems to have completely abandoned its, titular communism. So how is the situation different in China? What are the institutional controls on Xi Jinping, for example?
That's what actually worries me a lot. I don't think, so Putin became a personalistic dictator over time, right? There were party structures, but he eventually kept hollowing them out. There was the Duma, but he kind of hollowed them out as well, until there's really just him. He did it through, in the same way that Stalin and Mao did it too, which is really interesting. Stalin and Mao were both, they weren't like real military leaders, right? They weren't really kind of great thinkers. What they were, what launched their kind of road to control, is that they controlled the membership. They were the membership coordinators. So for any groups you have, just be careful of the membership coordinator. Because you are the one who determines who is in and who is out, who gets what position versus not. Xi Jinping was done a lot, was kind of similar. He wasn't like the membership coordinator, but he was very much in control of like who gets in, who gets out. And so you're right, this 20th Party Congress that happened in October, November of last year, there are still the party strictures around Xi Jinping. There are still these sort of factions and groups, but they're weakening rapidly. As and the 20th Party Congress was a big hit to that. And so while I don't think that Xi Jinping is anywhere close to a personalistic dictatorship in the mold of Putin, that's just a matter of time, possibly, as opposed to a matter of political incentives and structure.
Okay, and now we'll turn to a question about trouble on the US front. If the US defaults on its debt, on the national debt, what are the implications with China?
All right, so we really shouldn't do that.
What's that?
We really shouldn't default on our debt. That's really bad.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes.
Put it out there. I mean, remember, defaulting your debt is not
Right.
we're saying for. It's that we won't pay for things that we've already borrowed on. B, countries are not companies, they're not households. We can borrow things because we have the reserve currency in the world, and we can get it for really sweet deals. And so long as that debt is going towards productive consumption, then it's great. We probably should pay off some of it, but yeah. But what are the implications if we default? It's kind of nuclear politics. We talk about mutually assured destruction. It's kind of the same thing. Like if we default on our debt, then all the debt that China holds, all of our US bonds that China holds, instantly become just not worthwhile. And so you'll see a run on people trying to sell off American currency, American bonds, which going back to your interest rates, it's going to go sky high, right? Like if I have a whole bunch of bonds, I need to pay someone to take them, essentially, or more to take them. As a result of that, trade relations between the United States and its partners kind of people are going to start looking to denominate trade in something other than dollars, which may flip to giving China reserve currency status. Probably not. You'll probably get a basket of currencies like the EU, the yen, the renminbi. China's been trying to diversify its economy through what it calls dual circulation strategy. More of an internal consumption. That's the first circulation. On the international side, decoupling from the United States. But we're still highly coupled. Certainly in non-strategic goods. And so if the US defaults somehow, we'd have global recession, would definitely impact China. China probably has enough currency reserves to get through some of it, better than we could, certainly. But they're facing, like, not just China. I think just focusing on China is perhaps the wrong lens. Like the entire globe would face like just an uncertain future if we do that. It'd just be bad. Just put that.
Yeah. Okay, it's bad.
Yeah. I'm not an international political economist. They would be able to answer specifically how this all trace out. But from what I know, just
Okay. All right. Now a question about the Uyghurs, the Chinese minority group. How does that figure into their group dynamic versus individualism?
yeah.
Is that an indication of their wanting to suppress individual thinking? Or is it something else?
Yes and no, in the sense that, like, yeah, I talked about kind of racism or chauvinism. This is very much the case vis-a-vis the Uyghurs. China has these ethnic groups, and they showcase specific individuals, like, hey, look how, like, usually they're women, look how pretty this ethnic minority woman is, and look, she gets to be like a pop star and that kind of thing. And they kind of showcase them on these TV shows to put like a thin veneer of we have racial harmony within our country. They have like these great propaganda posters and that. But all that said, it's less about we often think in the United States, and I think this is mistaken, that racism is about an internal thing, right? You are a racist. You
Mhm,
have some sort of innate characteristic that makes you such and such. But
mhm,
racism is very much more about state structure and political power. Um,
mhm,
why do we suppress African Americans in through various ways? Because they are a threat to the status quo of political power, or
mhm,
certain groups as political power. Same
mhm,
thing happens with the Uyghurs. Because they're an ethnic minority, they are able to coalesce and organize in a social movement sense in a way that is fundamentally threatening to the CCP's power.
mhm.
There was the Falun Gong, this sort of, they call it a cult. It started off as like a martial arts kind of meditation sort of thing.
Did you
Um,
say the Falun Gong?
the Falun Gong, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and obviously not ethnic whatsoever.
Mhm,
But the Chinese government really went hard in suppressing them
mhm,
because they are they are an issue of like they're a social movement, right? A
mhm.
collective action group which threaten their power. BTS, that South Korean boy band.
I don't know. I'm sorry.
There's a there's a there's a
This is
South Korean boy
K-pop, is that right?
just came up. My daughters, like one day, like they're evidently super popular. My daughters, I'm like, what the hell language is that? And they're like, it's yes. I'm like, are you singing in Korean? Like, okay. South Korea has amazing soft power. You look at Netflix and like all the shows like my wife is watching the zombie one, which she loves South Korean. But BTS, there was a Trump rally in 2019, maybe 2020, where the campaign was hyping up, hey, we've sold like 1 million tickets. And what ended up happening was BTS fan groups had organized on the fan websites because the tickets were free. You just had to
Uh-huh.
register, right?
Yeah.
They organized and they bought up all of like they were the ones driving up the 1 million tickets. And so it was huge egg on the face for the campaign because it ended up that only like 2,000 people showed up for this like monster venue. And so they had to arrange Trump to like be backstopped by like only the limited number of people who were there. And so that was really, really threatening to authoritarian regimes
Mhm.
in Asia. And this one of the reasons why the Xi has cracked down on video games. It's not
Mm.
because of it was pitched as a sort of like, well, video games don't make you manly. I'm like, all right, whatever. um, it's because video games have really strong fan groups.
Mhm.
So if BTS fan group can do this and like
Mhm.
humiliate the US president, then what could a video game fan group do to Xi Jinping?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
He's,
the Uyghurs,
yeah.
you suppress because it's a political
Mhm,
threat. You don't suppress because you have an
mhm,
ideological commitment. I mean, sometimes you do, but like it's more about these
mhm.
groups are a threat. You got to keep them down.
But could you talk a minute about the existence, if there is such a thing, of racism in China? I'm thinking, for example, I know that in Japan, uh, prospective bridal and bridal parents sometimes demand proof of pure Japanese descent.
Oh
That's
wow.
a level of racism that we don't approach, I think, in the United States. How does China figure in on that spectrum?
I mean, sometimes they do.
Maybe
Here.
they do. I don't know. Maybe, I'm sorry. I shouldn't make
No, no, no. I mean,
sweeping generalizations.
no, no, no. It's how do I put this? Um, I mean, I don't know. Like, I honestly don't know where the racism
Mhm,
comes from. Like, as an individual matter, when it gets down to issues of of um of like marriage, for example, I just don't know where it comes from.
mhm,
But I would imagine it partly comes from what's it called? When you know you encounter political issues, right, or things that upend the economic order. So Japan, right? The encounter with Perry was a searing, devastating one. The encounter in China with the colonial forces that just kind of forced open a lot of these Chinese ports was not a great one either.
Mhm.
And it's sort of, maybe it just comes down to the sort of in-group, out-group kind of thing. And it's easier, the more you're able to consolidate your ethnic control or your political control, and then when you encounter new groups, it just kind of creates that sort of dynamic. And it's, I mean, I honestly, I tend to think that the anti-racist thinking, framing, like kind of beliefs, those are the hard ones. It's really, really hard to say on a social as well as a political and a personal level. I have to check myself because I have these biases, right? It's really, really easy to say those guys are really weird and I don't like them. And so, I mean, I don't know where it comes from, but it is quite common. I think you're right, in Judy, in Asia about that, just because, you know, skin color, or skin tone, I should say, is really kind of, is like, you know, there's this obsession with women in East Asia not getting suntans, which I know is kind of ironic in the United States. We love tans. So we have higher rates of skin cancer, whatever. But there's this obsession with being as white as possible. And so when your boyfriend, girlfriend has like darker skin, it's often considered to be kind of a bad thing. And yeah.
Okay.
So, sorry, can't answer that question really very well.
Okay. Now a question about Japan. Japan, this viewer says, has invested massively in support of Ukraine. And is that because of its relationship vis-a-vis China, as much as, you know, perhaps its interest in the individual freedoms of the Ukrainian people?
That's interesting. You know, one thing that I worry about is the extent to which you have trade-offs between Europe and Asia. The more that the US gets involved in Europe, the less resources that you would think it would have in Asia. But somehow that's not what's happening. And I don't know why. I have a whole book saying like, hey, these trade-offs happen, you gotta watch out for them. And now they're not happening. I'm like, well, crap, I was and so think of like AUKUS, for example, the Australian, UK, US. Why is the UK in Australia? Like, why are they making a military agreement to provide submarines that might be a springboard for other things? Why do we see these sorts of greater European contacts with Taiwan and Japan? Like, by rights, Europe should just say, hey, this is good. The US is focusing on us. We don't care what happens in the Pacific. And so one thing I'd love to know more about is like, well, why is that the case? Why is it that, you know, is it economic ties? Is it, and this is something that I think might be a stronger factor. Is it about norms and international rules? Is it about international order? Is it because if the US isn't willing to protect something like Ukraine, or certainly Taiwan, that means it won't protect other countries, right? And those countries have an impact on us. So for example, you know, I've said this before, but like if the US does not defend Taiwan against the Chinese invasion, the Philippines has got to be scared because they're less valuable than Taiwan. If China takes over Taiwan, then it's really easy for it to project. The Philippines kind of becomes extraneous in some US calculations. But what was really interesting to me was that when, I think this was in 2016, 2018, there was concern about the US abandoning Taiwan, and a bunch of Eastern and Central European countries called up their US counterparts to say, hey, what does this mean? I think it was the US was not going to participate, was canceling exercises with South Korea. And so a whole bunch of Central and Eastern European military said, hey, well, hold on. What does that mean? If you're not going to go with South Korea, we know we're not as economically powerful or as valuable to you as South Korea. Are we still good? Right? And that sort of reputational linkage is really powerful, I think. And might be the reason why you see these kind of linkages. So in terms of Japan, I think that is kind of the thing, right? Japan has sought a way for itself to, and I'm not a Japan expert, but this is why I imagine it's going on, is the Japanese government has persistently tried to push the envelope in terms of its ability to engage militarily, and not just defend itself, but provide support to broader international kind of things that are in line with international norms. So they provide a lot of money in the 1991 Gulf War, to the point where I think the US actually made money out of the war somehow. And we didn't want to, but we're like, oh, okay, cool. Ukraine is kind of in line with that. It's in line with the Japanese desire, the domestic, by some of its politicians to kind of get out of the shackles of its constitution to be able to be more proactive militarily. This is a good way to signal that, hey, look, South Korea, you don't have to worry about our military. We're going to help defend the international norms that you also value too. We are not interested in taking you over. You can see it by Ukraine, and that only helps to bolster support for Taiwan vis-a-vis China and these sort of international norms as well.
Question, why doesn't China like the Dalai Lama or the Pope?
Same sort of reason, I think, as the Uyghurs and the Falun.
Yeah.
That wasn't a question.
The Pope is really interesting, right? It's really hard to coerce someone, and I think this kind of relates back to the Putin question, right? It's really hard to coerce someone who is not motivated by material economic things, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't help Pope care about like trade. Like the Vatican City is tiny. It doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter at all. And the more that the Chinese crack down on, say, Catholics in China, right, the less ability they have to kind of push back against the Pope, right? Because like the Pope's like, well, all right, I guess you're not going to care about my cardinals. I can say whatever I want. And it has, but you know, because he's a religious leader, he has this ability to speak that elides Chinese power and strictures in a way that they can really just do nothing about.
Yeah. We are almost out of time, but we can't end without bringing up one question, at least, about the spy balloon, the infamous white balloon. Would you want to talk about that? Did the United States deal with that situation appropriately? What should we have done differently? Will there be more? What would you like to say about the white balloon?
You know, I put this. I really wanted to give the Chinese a pass on the spy balloon thing. Like, I'm like, look, it's, you know, it's really high up. So that seems to me as kind of, it makes sense that it would be a spy thing. It's kind of large for a spy balloon, for a weather balloon, I mean. So I was like, it's really high up. So it makes sense it would be a weather balloon that kind of tracks. It's kind of large to be a weather balloon. So that's kind of a strike against the Chinese. But, you know, the Chinese had like really bad winds and storms a couple months back. So it kind of seems like, sure, that might be okay. But what really did it for me was the Chinese reaction to the shoot down, especially. But it's like, look, if this is an accident, right? And, you know, we've all been in situations where we messed up, right? And so what do? You can double down and be really belligerent, and everyone thinks like, oh, well, they realize like that's just not good. Or if you really want to be contrite about this, if you're genuinely thinking like, you look, I messed up, then you say things like, look, I get it. It's in your airspace. Sorry, we didn't know about it in advance. Here's the details on it from what we can tell. You know, if you want to shoot it down, we get it. We prefer not. We prefer to handle this diplomatically. We're happy to share anything that happens, like with what's in it. But if you want to shoot it down, we totally get it. You be contrite, right? You kind of say like, look, we're sorry. Instead, they said this was silly, and the US is weak for shooting it down. It was aggressive for shooting it down. You had all this anti-US propaganda happening on their global mouthpieces, but also domestically. And it's like, well, look, if it really wasn't that big of a deal, then what's all this fuss about, right? Like, why is this an issue? And so it's, at least personally for me, made me think like, well, maybe this was a spy thing. And I'm now
I'm afraid we are going to have to end it there. I so apologize. This has
Sorry.
been a most interesting session. I also apologize to everyone whose question I didn't get to. They were extremely good questions. We have more of them now than we did when the question period started. Before we go, I do need to make a couple of announcements. I want to thank, of course, our speaker enormously. Such an interesting talk. I want to also thank Paul McClagan, who did an excellent job behind the scenes. I want to thank Carmi Blythus, and I want to thank most of all our excellent audience who always comes up with such very good questions. So we'll see you all next time, I hope. Thank you very much.